Right. Just first of all, would like to ask you to introduce yourself, to tell us where you work and the sort of research that you're involved in.
My name is Razack Karriem, and I teach at the University of the Western Cape in the Institute for Social Development. And my research interest is broadly around the role of social movements in promoting development from below. So my research focus on the Brazilian landless movement, and now is sort of moving into looking at service delivery protests in South Africa.
I have to say that your paper that you've just presented was fascinating at the BRICS conference in Livingston. I was wondering whether we could just talk about it for a while. You made, I think, a potentially quite subversive comparison between the very impressive landless movement in Brazil, comparing it with the LPM in South Africa, which has had a far more problematic history, wasn't able to evolve into the sort of organisation that we see in Brazil. Could you talk a little bit about your research and that comparison in particular, and areas that that help our understanding of the development of the LPM in South Africa?
Well, I initially started out doing my doctoral research looking at comparative analysis of the MST and the landless people's movement, but I eventually had to shift course as my supervisors felt that it was going to be financially taxing, and time-wise I probably wouldn't finish or take longer to finish, and so I decided to focus on the Brazilian landless movement, hoping to come back to looking at comparative analysis. It's taken me quite a while, and so the invite to the conference over this week was really helpful, because it kind of gave me the opportunity to kind of look at the MST and the landless people movements in comparative perspective. And I've always wanted to kind of see what lessons there were, and I think the key thing that stood out for me was in a sense from the founding of both movements kind of helped me better understand why the Brazilian landless movement grew into this national movement, and the landless people's movement kind of, in a sense, from its founding in 2001 sort of declined over time. And I think as I tried to show in my presentation, the institutional host, for lack of a better description, for the MST, in a sense, of the Pastoral Land Commission, and particularly the liberation theologians associated with the Pastoral Land Commission, played a formative role in shaping the political and organizational praxis of the MST. So by drawing on Marxist interpretations of the Bible, they sort of delved into the cultural realm of the landless in rural Brazil. And in this sense, sort of, I found it quite interesting, because instead of bringing in Marxism from the outside, they worked within the common sense of what, as Gramsci would say, of the landless people in Brazil, where religion was still quite strong. So one of the key things was in getting the central idea behind the liberation theology was that people can make change here on earth rather than wait for it in heaven. And so by doing that, and drawing on the Bible, they were able to give the ideological tools for the landless in Brazil to understand the social reality and make change. Which essentially the key point that liberation theology made was that you have a right to land, that land is a gift from God, and in that way they provided a counter-hegemonic narrative to the whole idea of private property. And so a number of my interviews, many people said, if land is a gift from God, we have a right to it. So there's this enduring legacy of the ideals of liberation theology to this very day. And so on the flip side, the Landless People's Movement, the institutional host, the National Land Committee, while committed to rural struggles and committed to the establishment of a people-driven movement, actually played a role that, in my view, sort of militated against the formation of an independent, worker-driven movement. And in large measure, the tension within the workers, the National Land Committee, there was tension between two groups, essentially, basically the majority group that supported the formation of the LPM, but an LPM that just put sufficient pressure on the state to deliver land. Whereas on the other hand, we had the more radical minority group within the National Land Committee that was influenced by the ideals of the Landless People's Movement, the Brazilian Landless People, the Brazilian Landless Movement, the MST, who felt that they will negotiate with the state, but if the state doesn't deliver, they will occupy. But this ambiguous relationship, in a sense, led to, one, the split of the National Land Committee, because the group that felt that there should be sufficient pressure didn't necessarily, they may disagree with the policy, but they felt the policy wasn't delivering land fast enough, whereas the other group felt actually the policy, the willing buy, willing seller policy, was actually the fundamental problem, and that it needed a much more transformative process, and that land occupations could be the means. Now the majority camp had sort of 1 foot or 2/3 of a foot with the state, because they were actually service providers for the state. And so we had a situation where this faction in the National Land Committee, or the National Land Committee in a sense, had sort of transformed itself from an activist NGO in the apartheid period to a more technocratic professional NGO in the post-apartheid period, where it was actually implementing land reform projects, especially in redistribution and restitution. And so in a sense, that tension came to a head and split the National Land Committee, but also undermined the very forward movement of the Landless People's Movement, because the donor monies were managed by the National Land Committee and not by the members of the Landless People's Movement. And so in a sense, from its inception, the Landless People's Movement was not autonomous, and so there was clearly political education, and there was definite commitment from both sides, but more so from the more radical side. But in a sense, I think there's a sense of self-reflection from the progressive factions of the National Land Committee, that actually NGOs played a role in undermining the formation of an independent movement. And so the challenge is, or the outcome is, that the LPM, in a sense, took a more high-profile position through these two World United Nations conferences, the first one in 2001, the United Nations World Conference Against Racism in Durban, and the UN World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg. And so in a sense, it would appear to me that the movement, while trying to build a base, focused more at projecting itself nationally rather than the painstaking work of building a movement on the base. So whereas on the other side, the MST, in a sense, was built organically from the base up, and it was able to socially reproduce itself through political education, promoting political education, and getting people to understand the political economy of Brazil, and in the process build new leadership. And so while the church plays a seminal role, there was a period where at the founding, so while the roots of the MST can be traced to land occupations in 1979, it was officially only founded in 1984. And at this founding Congress, there was a heated debate around whether the MST should stay under the tutelage of the church, particularly liberation theology, or if it should become an independent movement. Some people within the MST itself felt that the church, with its capillary presence throughout Brazil, offered them an opportunity and protection from the dictatorship. Others, the majority came within the MST, felt no, they should go independent. And one of the bishops in the Pastoral Land Commission, a very respected Bishop Pedro Casaldaliga, said the movement should be able to stand on its own feet. And I think that was decisive in moving the MST on its own path, where it drew on this organizational and political interventions of the Pastoral Land Commission to develop an independent path where it adopted much more strong, over time, a stronger Marxist position within its political practice.
Fascinating. Can I ask you to reflect more specifically on the comparison? And you brought out some fascinating things in your presentation. One which I found particularly interesting was the notion of political organisation, the role of ideas, of structure, and how vital that was to the success of the MST, and how unfortunately missing it was to the LPM.
I think the key thing is that the MST sees the land occupation as sort of the organizational matrix. One of the MST leaders and founders, João Pedro Stegeli, says that the land occupation is the organizational matrix of the movement. And it is through the land occupation that the MST's political praxis is shaped. And so through occupying land and its praxis of promoting and encouraging this thinking about theory and practice, it has been able to get people to see that land is important, but actually you also need something else. You need access to credit, you need access to infrastructure. So automatically they move from a particularistic struggle for land to more universal struggles. And from that they start seeing connections. Actually, we're not able to get access to all these things because the state favors certain classes. And so in a sense, through the land occupation and through the political education, especially in the land encampments, the MST is able to create a situation where increasing people start thinking beyond the struggle for the land. In a sense, as I was trying to show with the quotation from João that I interviewed in southern Brazil, he says, I joined the MST for land, but I realized that there are other people who also need land. And so in a sense, this whole idea of solidarity with others. So and moving from that, he sort of concludes his interview by saying that it is in the MST that I understood how Brazil is organized and who it is that is ruling. So in a sense, through this exposure, MST members, and here I want to stress that I'm not suggesting that all MST members are equally empowered. In my field research, I found that actually the level of consciousness varied across the geographies of Brazil. But what I did find was that there was a solid core of people throughout the movement. Going back to João that I interviewed in southern Brazil, he joined the MST in 1986, the occupied land, and it took him 3 years to get land. And he continued in the movement. And when I did the interview in 2004, he was still participating in the movement. So there is something about the MST's political praxis that allows members to continue participating in the movement. Because without that, and in that sense, the land occupation sets in motion this whole change in thinking. And that once on the land, there's a similar process of linking the struggles for land with the struggles on the land. And I think it is this, in a sense, I would say the originality and the strength of the movement is geared precisely in trying to link struggles for land with struggles on the land. And in linking struggles on the land, the MST is in a sense saying, and I didn't have the opportunity to kind of elaborate it in the presentation, is that the MST says that political power resides. We fight for land in the rural areas, in the countryside, but political power resides in the rural town, in the provincial town, capital, and in the national capital. And to that end, it has taken its struggles to the urban centers. So that just recently, last week, the MST organized protests in 13 states across Brazil in response to the budget cuts. I'm not sure if you're aware that presently the Workers' Party-led government, led by President Dilma Rousseff, has embarked upon a massive structural adjustment program, which has cut funding across the board, from infrastructure to education to agrarian reform. And the budget for agrarian reform was cut by 50%. And so the MST went onto the streets, occupied the provincial offices of the, or the state level offices of the Ministry of Agrarian Development and the Ministry of Finance in the capital Brasilia. And they met the chief of staff for Dilma Rousseff, who promised that they will be, they will look into it and they will get back to them in 2 weeks. We don't know what will happen. Now, the MST doesn't always succeed in getting what it wants, but it realized that without mobilization, it will not get anything. And so it is this ability to link the rural to the urban has allowed itself to build alliances with urban movements such as trade unions, women's groups. What was fascinating, one of the MST leaders, Gilmar Mauro, whenever I read his material, he's also a landless person, but who just, his analysis is just fascinating. And he says, if we want to make change, we have to build up links with the hip-hop movement. I mean, it just, and here it's this clear idea that if it wants to become a movement for change, it needs to build alliances with a range of movements. And here there's a direct link with the hip-hop movement, is with Afro-Brazilian movements, with women's movements, with, as I mentioned, the trade union movement and other movements in Brazil. And so I think the MST faces a very difficult juncture at this moment, because the current situation is not good for all left parties and progressive movements, because the financial crisis seems to have re-energized the political right. And there's, for the first time, that members of the political left, when they go into public spaces, are basically booed, and which is sort of a change. And in a sense, it comes down to the very notion of how the Workers' Party was more intent in managing capitalism rather than changing its 12 years of power. So, for example, Lula has been the figurehead, and so there's a term in Brazil that is referred to as Lulismo, in somewhat similar vein to, say, Peronismo. So the personality of Lula. And so what Lula did, he used, he was able to do quite a few things that was able to unite different social classes. Or, let me put it this way, he was able to appease different social classes. So, for example, finance capital was very happy with him, as much as they disliked him. You'd rather prefer somebody from the right wing, but they did not make as much money in all governments as they did under Lula. And so what Lula did, he also invested in the Bolsa Familia, which actually helped attenuate the worst excesses of poverty in rural and urban Brazil, which in some ways created a challenge for the MST, because whereas before it could attract more people, as the Bolsa Familia was expanded, it was able to recruit less members. And so in a sense, this policy militated against the praxis of the movement, because less people wanted to go in, because now we're getting the Bolsa Familia, even though it was so little. And so the MST realizes that it's facing a very difficult conjuncture. But coming back to Lula, so Lula's advantage was, and here again, he took advantage of a historical moment when the global economy grew. Commodities was exported, and so he was able to utilize the surplus, of course, to pay the debt, and appease the financial elite, and able to provide infrastructure to small-scale farmers, but at the level of land redistribution. The MST made more gains under the Cardoso administration than it did under the Lula. Under the Lula administration, Lula promised to settle 400,000 families in his first year. He was able to settle 401,000 over 8 years. But if that was bad, under the current administration of Dilma Rousseff, who was basically anointed by Lula, the MST has made very, very few gains.
Can I ask you now, briefly, what the major lessons from the experience, and you've already indicated some of the serious contradictions and problems that now face the movement in Brazil, but can you draw out the most important lessons for a project of popular rural development and transformation in South Africa and potentially other parts of the continent?
You know, I'll go back to an interview I did with a MST member. I'd gone to visit a land reform settlement in southern Brazil, and fascinating, it's a cooperative. So this cooperative seconds 3 members to work full-time for the MST. So they go out and recruit members, etc. So one of the members, Melania, took me to an encampment. And she introduced me to people. They asked me to speak about the struggle for land in South Africa, which I did. And then later on, she tells me, you see those 2 activists? I said, yeah. When this encampment was formed, they were sort of the politically advanced members. Because the 2 of them, one had worked for a trade union and another one was involved in urban movement. But what they did was they were dominating discussion. And so what she did, she then arranged for the 2 of them to go on political education classes and political leadership classes, which opened up space for the other members to then get their voice and sort of become politically conscious. But more than that, what she says, so I said, no, what happens if people leave the movement afterward? I said, look, she said, there are people who already left, but if there's one thing we want, and I think that is key for understanding not just Brazil, but South Africa and other parts of the world, is if there's one thing we want to impart, is that people do not accept their level of oppression, the level of exploitation. If we can do that, we would have made a massive advance. And I think it is that attention to creating a political consciousness, to understanding how power works, that I think needs to be massified. I think, and I think the MST's whole sort of praxis implicitly resembles sort of a war position, where there's this constant need to understand, to both struggle, but also to reflect. And it is this ability to bring the 2 together that allows members to kind of open up their ideas, to think through how they can make change. And I think the challenge in South Africa, and yeah, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, and I think even in Brazil, the MST says, look, we may be a national movement now, but we're still weak. They acknowledge that there's still another 5 million landless families we haven't organized. And so there's a critical self-reflection that it has not been able to mobilize as many people as it wants to, but that actually also it's not just a rural thing, it's how to bring the rural and the urban together. And I think the challenge for South Africa, as it is for Zimbabwe, Zambia, Mozambique and elsewhere, is how to create alliances between the rural and the urban, but how that alliances is based in a sense on process of critical reflection, but also on action. And I think that is the challenge. And if I go back to that that interview, it just stuck with me, and I always remember it, because it is when I meet people, they can talk at various levels about their level of oppression and what they need to do, even if they may not succeed. And I think understanding your social condition and knowing that you can act, because one of the things I think that I picked out and that's emblematic of the MST is it says, look, you can make change, that we are not passive victims. And I think here it comes back to that seminal role that liberation theologians play, that you can make change here in the now rather than wait for it later on.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
No, you're welcome.